Andrew, would you like to give us a reflection now on what you learned looking at high rainfall, flooding, and the compound events? Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, thanks, Pete. Yeah, so board one on excess rainfall and flooding, and then compound events, which we'll go on to in a bit. And it's good to hear Rosie talking about agroforestry as a good adaptation option for wind damage, because that also came up as part of our discussions on excess rainfall. So agroforestry and regenerative agriculture both got quite a lot of enthusiasm, both as an adaptation option, but also as a good topic for some policy interventions and being able to incentivize those types of agriculture as a good solution for that. A couple of other things on the production side that have a lot of enthusiasm. So one is being able to slow down water. So there's a few comments about having extra drainage as a good solution, but actually being able to have options that slow down the water flow. Those were the ones that are particularly valuable. And I guess we'll come on to consequences of that and how that might interact with actually holding up water for use later on. So that was interesting. And one other thing on the production side that was valuable or interesting is that actually having an alternative production system that is completely isolated from the weather is great in some regards. So the sort of vertical farming perspectives got again quite a lot of interest from this group, and that obviously gives protects you from your climate hazards, but again with a few other interesting consequences, which no doubt we'll discuss later in the day. What else on the wholesaling and retailing? So again, some of these are being covered elsewhere. So the supply chain management, and it's quite a broad topic, isn't it? But so all the sort of redundancy and diversification is clearly important. A greater understanding of the choke points and key vulnerabilities, and actually mandated reporting around the supply chain risks. So a sort of set of interlinked adaptation options and policy suggestions there. Increased rainfall is going to have implications for grain storage, so that may require updated regulation for that. And then in the disposing and reusing on the waste, then increased guidance, regulation, and consumer education for being able to minimise those is likely to be valuable. Okay, so I think those are probably the key points from the excess rainfall. So we'll go on to compound events, which is one of those which is potentially a vast subject, because there's obviously a whole array of compound events. So I guess we thought mainly about potentially warm and wet events, particularly in winter, that potentially have adverse impacts for pests and diseases, and also some soil breakdowns, and also so that was our main focus. But I guess thinking about compound events, probably the most popular thought was actually we don't really know very much about, or certainly not enough about, how compound events affect agricultural production. So being able to increase that research gap is going to be really valuable. Real-time monitoring and modelling and assessing the impacts as compound events develop, and as the risks of those become more and more obvious throughout a season or a year, is going to be valuable. Going back to something that Pete said in his first feedback session, the link with the international aspect is also going to be interesting. So the risks of international or shocks to international production, if they coincide to UK production, that kind of compound event, being able to understand that and the risks of that, ideally being able to forecast that is going to be a valuable thing to know. And what else have we got? Two more things. Warm, wet weather is bad for aflatoxins. So anything to increase the prediction and detection of how likely those are going to be in storage is going to be useful. And final point, just on the transport and trading option, which again kind of relates to I think all of the other groups, is a complicated area. So actually doing a good robust mapping exercise of the risks across all sort of aspects of that will be a very useful adaptation option or policy intervention. It probably fits into both categories. Anna and Lizzie, what have I missed?
I think that was good. Thanks, Andrew.
Cool.
Yeah, I don't think you missed anything there.
Sounds like you've covered it well, so thank you very much. And it's also really interesting to hear how much overlap there is. I think we expected it to some degree across the not just the weather hazards and the boards, but also across some of the different categories and the dimensions of the food chain. We do have a little bit of time now, so unexpectedly we're running slightly ahead of time, which is great. So we have factored in a little bit of time if you have any thoughts or questions you'd like to raise. So if you do, then please use the question and answer function in the bottom bar of Zoom, and we will try to answer those. Or invite you to explain. Sounds like you're all quiet and ready for lunch. I'll give it another few minutes or so. But yeah, if you do have anything you'd like to raise or ask or about the process and how it's working, if there's anything we can tweak, that's also useful to learn, or any challenges you're having or anything's going particularly well. Oh, Luke, yes, please. Can we unmute Luke?
Hi, Pete. Just in the interest of trying to encourage a bit of participation, maybe. I think there's quite contented silence there. I'm struck that we've spoken quite a bit about the kind of role of nature-based solutions, and we've also kind of talked about the role of innovation and the importance of that in this context. And I wonder kind of the extent to which these things can support each other, or areas where they might be in conflict, and it might be worth considering that a little bit in our kind of deliberations and discussions. Thank you, Chair.
Yeah, thanks. That's a really useful point, Luke. Actually, if anyone would like to comment on nature-based solutions and innovation and how we can move forward with those, that would be fantastic. I should say also, do use the Q&A throughout, because we will be looking at those and ask you to vote on those for the final session. And yeah, okay. It sounds like there's one. Yeah, I will answer one quick more. There's a question here about making the boards available to everyone. Yes, I think we can and probably should, so that everyone can reflect and have a look at those. And I think after answering one, as Sarah suggested, as Anthony suggested, we could allow a little more time on the open discussion at the end. So from Sarah Bridle, have we thought about the differential impact of these issues on different groups, especially lower income groups? only very passingly, I think my colleague Celia Petty is probably well placed to answer this. We did make a very brief mention and a thought about that in the limited space we had in the paper, but no, it's a really important point, and one that came up in our heatwave and high temperature event. Celia, are you on the call? And I wondered
Yes,
if you,
I am.
yeah,
Can you hear me? Yeah. No, just to confirm that this, in many respects, it's the end of the food chain. And we have government policies that are promoting, high food, that we ought to be eating foods of high nutritional value. And unfortunately, these are the foods that are most expensive. So in our deliberations, actually, a couple of points were made around potentially making it easier through different strategies, whether those would be targeted support to low-income families, or there are many different ways that this could be approached, or just controlling prices, and highly contentious, but I think really, really important not to duck this one, because as I say, it is the end point of so much of the government's efforts across the health system, across the whole social policy area. So definitely one not to forget. So thanks for raising that.
Yeah, and Anthony also, thank you very much, makes the point about vulnerability differing for different ethnic groups, and factoring that in too, which is another dimension as well. And there's some comments there. Okay, well, I think as everyone's been put some sterling effort really into the discussions on the board, let's break a little early. Shall we try to come back at about, let's see how far are we running ahead. If we come back just after 1 o'clock and restart breakout session 2, if that's okay with everyone, it'll then allow us a little more time in the agenda at the end. We might well catch up after the feedback as well, and have a little more time. So it would be nice to have a deeper discussion. So, okay, yeah. Yeah, if we come back sometime after, I mean, the breakout sessions are open. There's comments on the timing there. That they'll just be using the same boards again, but in a different context, looking at the knock-on trade-offs and consequences. So yeah, please do join in when you're able, and we will be back shortly after 1. Thank you. Okay, everybody, so welcome back from lunch, and thank you for joining us. Hope you've had a good break, and thank you very much for your contributions in the morning. I think there were some excellent and interesting discussions going on. So basically, we are now going to move into this afternoon's breakout sessions, which you'll be staying in the same breakout groups, basically working on the same boards and on the same weather hazards, but this time building on the work that you did looking at adaptation and policy options to look at the knock-on trade-offs, consequences, co-benefits, feedbacks. What are the implications of taking those adaptation and policy options? So it will be building very much on the work that was done this morning and with the same hosts. So let's now move into the breakout groups. Thank you. Okay, everyone, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your efforts. We had some really interesting discussions there, and actually in my group, we ended up editing and changing some of what we put down as adaptations and policy options to change them to consequences, because it's quite a complex territory when you start to get into the depths of it. So we are now going to have a break for just about a little bit under 15 minutes and come back for the plenary reporting. And if we can rattle through that fairly quickly, that will make a little bit more time for questions and answers at the end. So if we can be back at 2:30, please. Thank you very much, and see you shortly. Okay, hello everyone, welcome back. And Thank you for joining us again. So we're now going to move into reporting back from the breakout groups, looking at the trade-offs and consequences of the adaptation and policy options that you all identified this morning. And so we are going to go in the order of Andrew, Rosie, Stacey, and then me. So Andrew, would you be able to let us know some of your findings, please? Thank you.
Yeah, of course. So, just to remind you that he's talking about the excess rainfall, flooding risk, and then also the compound events. There's, as I'm sure you all found, these are quite complicated systems, aren't they? So we had some, some really interesting thoughts across both of them. There are a couple that are really specific to what we're looking at. So agroforestry was one that came up. That has a whole host of co-benefits, whether it's carbon storage or mitigating also against wind erosion of soil or against drought, and also giving more diverse income streams to farmers. A lot of different benefits there. Similarly, anything that's to do with slowing water down after heavy rainfall has quite a lot of co-benefits. Either for if you store that water for mitigating or increasing your water availability for future droughts, and actually also you get potential biodiversity and river flow benefits as well. So that's quite an interesting one. A few things that are sort of I suspect more general. So we talked a little bit about some of the funding possibilities. So anything where you incentivize something, there's a limited pot of funding. So anything that you incentivize, then by definition you're going to be not incentivizing something else. So there's a trade-off there that will apply to whatever decisions you make. There's a few things that have some moral hazard issues. So, for example, if you insure against excess rainfall events, then that will mitigate your financial challenges that might arise, but also it might limit your incentive to adapt to that in other ways. There was also quite a common theme of some trade-offs to do with the more resilient you are, you might be less efficient or less productive in normal years. So part of that was in terms of resilient crop varieties or livestock breeds might be lower yielding, which might be an issue. And I guess in the sort of post-production food chain, then a lot of the adaptation options there, whether that's increased redundancy or diversification, or extra reporting, or all of those kind of things, they will add extra cost onto businesses. So they potentially have a trade-off there to consider. Having said that, then anything that you do for improving supply chain resilience to do with excess rainfall will actually also improve your supply chain resilience across the whole range of risks, and actually probably not just from a food system perspective, but it may also have wider benefits as well. A couple of points of differentiation that came up in the discussion earlier. Regulations. We were talking about regulations for grain storage in our particular perspective, but actually regulations may have a disproportionate effect on smaller businesses rather than larger businesses. And just on the waste side of the world, then guidance or regulation or incentives to reduce waste, they may fall disproportionately on lower income consumers. If there's less incentives for wealthy consumers to change their behaviour, potentially. So I think that was everything that the sort of key themes from our sort of flooding aspect. Anna and Lizzie, anything missing from there? Go on to compound events.
No, I think that was everything. Thank you.
Okay, so obviously a lot of these also apply to the compound event. So a couple of things that came up that seemed really interesting from my perspective. So there was a bit about, we talked in the earlier session about how Exeter research and understanding compound events, their risks, how they affect agriculture would be valuable, and I'm sure it would be. There's some interesting thoughts that actually more research just allows decision makers to put off making decisions. So maybe there's some truth in that, but that was an interesting perspective. We talked a little bit about using weather and climate forecasts to allow better decision making. So if you can forecast what your weather's going to be over the weeks or months ahead, then you can better choose which crops are going to be most resilient. That's great. Apart from, what if? This is my favorite comment of the whole breakout session. What if everyone is so used to following your forecast, and everyone does the same thing, and you get it wrong? Then you might find out that actually you're in a much worse position, because actually you have a a very limited spread of decisions. So I thought that was quite an interesting perspective, and actually a more hedging perspective might reduce your risk. One more point. I think anything involving a model or a forecast, this doesn't really fit in. This was an other box. Anything involving a model or a forecast needs very careful handling of uncertainty, which is an important point we felt, but didn't really fit in any of the other boxes. Yeah. Okay. I think that was a bit of a spread of the key things we've covered. Unless anyone else in the group wants to add anything else that I've missed.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Very comprehensive. So thanks for that. Let's move now to group 3 and Rosie. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Pete. And thanks, Andrew. It was interesting hearing from your groups, and you'll notice there are some overlaps. So our group first focused on drought and low rainfall. And in the previous session, we talked about potentially changing what crops are grown or the types of crops, and changing water storage as well to try and increase resilience. So we started off by having a conversation about how this would actually change the landscape of the UK. So if you're used to seeing certain crops grown, or we had the example of, you go to the Lake District for the views of what you think the Lake District looks like, but that landscape is controlled by sheep grazing. That's the farming that's done in that area. So we talked about what's the trade-off between growing different crops and changing the landscape of the UK, and the implications for things like tourism. When we talked about changing in terms of water storage and reservoirs, not only does that change the landscape, but what does that mean? Kind of what ethical implications are there for that in terms of water resources? So if you're storing more water, where is it not going? Are you not replenishing groundwater? And who may be impacted by that? Kind of trying to come back and really incorporate that comment before lunch about thinking about which groups may be impacted. Kind of on the same theme, we had such an interesting discussion, but it was about thinking about, the consumer of today isn't the consumer of tomorrow. So the changing crops, there may be shifts in demand for different crops. And we started talking about kind of how can you change what people eat? And Tom mentioned some, historically, people in Italy haven't always eaten what we think of today as Italian food. We thought about how we could maybe bring turnips back. Big fan of turnips in our group, also oats and leeks. But how can we bring back these crops that grow really well in the UK to the UK market? Which kind of brought us at the end of our discussion towards how can we think about changing consumer attitudes or perceptions about different crops, or behavioural changes, and what to eat. And then we decided we're not qualified to answer this question because we need more people in the room than we had. Bringing in an interdisciplinary group would be really key for answering that question. And Rosa added that changing perceptions theoretically might be easy. Be like, oh, just eat this instead. It's much better for you and it grows well in this climate. But it's not that logical. There's a lot of kind of cultural implications for what people eat and why. So it was a really interesting discussion. But kind of when we started thinking about those consequences, we realized that it's really important to have interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary teams working on this to make sure that there are no negative consequences and that you're kind of thinking around the whole problem. So our second hazards was wind and storms. And we kind of started off in a similar place to Andrew's group, talking about agroforestry. So we talked a lot about soil erosion in our first session this morning. And so there was talks about, well, actually, if you keep more soil or you plant trees, you may increase biodiversity and have increased resilience of the soil. But then we also talked about the other benefits of agroforestry, similar to what Andrew's group had mentioned, including other income streams and improving soil health and protection against different hazards. But we did talk about the negative consequences. I guess a negative part of that is that the startup costs can be quite a lot for agroforestry, and it can take a little bit of time before it becomes beneficial. So just that to add to what Andrew's group were talking about. We also talked a bit about kind of pests as well. From if there's more wind, you may get different pests coming in. And thinking about pesticide, if it's windy when you spray your pesticide, the pesticide is also getting to places that you don't want it to. So that was kind of an unintended consequence. And then we kind of moved our discussion to talking again about sort of perceptions, but also learning from different communities. So thinking about, for example, the road and rail delays, which we talked about last time, can we engage different communities and learn from them? And we talked about this kind of in both parts as well. Can we share learnings from global north and global south about, how do you become resilient, or how do you change perceptions, or, all of these together? Can we kind of bring the global community into those conversations? And interestingly, we ended our second discussion in the exact same place as the first discussion, that, being interdisciplinary is really key. We felt that to understand the real implications, we needed kind of everyone from hydrologists and crop modelers all the way through to kind of social scientists as well, just to understand these big systems. So kind of importance moving forward of thinking about who's in the room and who's around the table when you have these discussions.
Thank you, Rosie. Oh, I was just going to leave. I forgot to ask if any of your co-hosts had.
Yes, whether Roz or Tom wanted to say anything. Yeah, then
before
more
I
than welcome to jump in.
All sounds good. Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Some really interesting insights. Couldn't agree more about the need for interdisciplinary research, but also, interestingly, some of the events we were involved in at COP27 late last year were also drawing together those global north-south partnerships and starting to think. I mean, to some degree, my reflection was that in some ways, in some facets of the science and what's going into practice, there was more, advanced thinking and implementation in some of the developing countries, and the energy of the research going on there. But of course, it's very different in nature, and the context completely different. So it's really interesting. I think there was certainly a lot to share between different perspectives, and the contexts were completely different socioeconomically, and so on and so forth. And also, whereas we were talking a lot about net zero as well as adaptation from a developing country perspective, that it was felt that certainly from a farmer perspective that had a lot less resonance in a developing country view. But really interesting. So hopefully we can have some interesting discussions on that moving forward. Can I now invite Stacey to talk to us about what Group 2 found? Thank you.
We found everything that Rosie found, even turnips. We discussed turnips and how we might not want to go back to a middle-aged diet, but I'll put more context into that. So our first climate extreme, weather extreme, was cold waves, snow and low temperature. So I'll give a few specific examples, and then we had much wider debates and we had some amazing discussions. So in terms of the specific kind of consequences, etc. We've got that if we are bringing more animals into a shared space because it's cold and we need to heat, we've got the unintentional consequence of using more heat, and so you're putting more pressure on energy supplies. And as we all know, in the current economic crisis, etc., that's a really big problem. And if we have to do that more in the future, obviously this is going to increase our dependency on such supplies. And this also has unintended consequences, as we know from the pandemic. I'm being very topical here, bringing animals in, large numbers of animals in together into shared spaces, you're going to have increased the risk of disease spreading a lot amongst a big community. So we need to think around disease incidents and how we adapt to this and bring in measures to make sure that we've got some resilience in that area. That also has a big impact on the economy and the environmental costs. So if we're building these new houses and sheds for animals, what impact does that have on land use? And then that got us talking about storm surges, which was our second extreme, and then how we want to reduce pressure on land. And so these are all very interconnected. So then we were talking kind of like what Rosie mentioned around changing crop type, and that led us back to talking around disease and introduction of new pests and new diseases, and but also kind of like the unintentional kind of benefits or advantages. So, lower crop losses due to frost if you're changing the crop. But also if we're introducing things like polytunnels and glass houses that get very hot, and then you have extremes on the other side of cold waves, etc., exposing those new crops to a whole different range of extremes. So thinking about that. We also talked about machinery, and in cold waves and snow, you're bringing in new machinery that might actually take the place of like human jobs. So thinking about how jobs will change in the future, becoming more skilled, more scientific. So depending on how you look at that, that could be a positive or a negative. And one that I particularly thought was really important was the pressure on the NHS. Again, another topical topic. So if we have more people working out in the cold and the snow, we're going to have unintentional consequences, more pressure on the NHS with more cold and disease related illnesses to our workforce. And then a big one that came out around consuming the consumers is if we move away from like just in time supply chains and we're changing the diet of people. So we're looking at more long lasting foods and things like that. There's potential backlash from the public around their behaviours and their choices being restricted. Also, one that got lots of thumbs up was around increasing strikes. If we can't get food to supermarkets and supply chains quickly enough, we could, you could see more strikes. And that's, a big impact of winter weather, as we all know, strikes, etc. So we had so many post-it notes for the snow, cold wave and low temperature group. I'll just quickly go across to the storm surge group. So again, we had, before we talked about policies around directing, incentivizing farmers to grow different food. We had a similar consequence that came up around backlash from the farmers. How do we incentivize farmers to change the way that they've been farming for generations, etc.? So thinking about that. What else did we have? Growing crops that need less nutrients, and then thinking about the wider implications on the soil of the environment. So how will that affect the nutrient content of the crops? And then if we are, looking at influencing the water upstream to reduce flooding in areas, what issue may that have on biodiversity and the local nature? And then we had, again, we had more things around backlash from the public around rationing, how do we encourage supermarkets to stress test against certain delays, and how do we incentivize supermarkets to put these plans in place? So lots around like the economy, incentivizing people. But one of the big themes that came out towards the end, when we had a much wider discussion, not just about storm surges, was around, I think, Rosie, you said it, around education and communication. How do we, I think a really important thing in this, and in the food security kind of world, is around education, and not only just education of the local communities, but wider, like organizations, governments. How do we, give them the right information about climate change, and where kind of these subsidies, or maybe not call them subsidies, should be best placed? What should we invest in the future? Things like that. We talked about community kitchens, and during the pandemic, how we realized as a community that community kitchens and coming together to work together locally is a really important thing as well. And then we had a really good debate around local versus global. Do we want to grow things locally? Is that good for, is it good, bad? Do we want to have to rely on trade, or is trade a good thing? So we had a really good debate. This is where the turnips came up around, if we rely too much on local, will we eventually turn into a middle ages food kind of system where we're just eating turnips and gruel and things like that. So yeah, some really great wider discussions, not just about storm surges and cold weather, Pete, but yeah, hopefully that gives you a bit of flavour about what we were talking about.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Is there anything from your co-hosts also?
Freya or Riaz, have I missed anything? We talked about a lot, so.
No, nothing from me. Again, really good discussion. Really well summarised, Stacey.
Yes.
Yeah, sounds like a fascinating discussion. I must admit, again, the interdisciplinary need for interdisciplinary approaches is really coming out here, all the way through into understanding livelihoods, skills, and behaviours across the industry, but all the way to consumers as well. I must admit, I hadn't anticipated the resurgence of turnips. I think there's clearly a piece of funding needed to look into this. I'm not sure whether I'm a fan or not, but I'll find out this weekend. So that's some homework for everyone to do before the next weekend, to find out if they like turnips. Yeah, recipes below, please. I understand quite a few don't have the Zoom Q&A feature. That is a fairly new Zoom thing, and I think we thought it would work regardless of your Zoom version. It appears it probably doesn't. So, oh yes, Neeps and Tatties, of course. So please do put your questions into the chat or the Q&A. If you've got the Q&A, put them in there. If you've got the chat, then if you've only got the chat, then put them in there. So it turns to me to update you about what we found about heatwave and international dimensions and the consequences. So in terms of production with heat waves, one of the things we mentioned with heat stress in grassland agriculture and pastures is around more diverse swards, which might bring in more non-native species for better or for worse, but potentially increase biodiversity rather than monocultures. We also wandered a bit there into agroforestry with the natural shading for livestock, trees and hedges, which I believe can increase water demands, but have benefits in terms of soil erosion and biodiversity and things like that. There are some other implications as well, things like livestock mixing with wildlife and diseases and so on. In terms of processing, really this is around things like working hours adaptation and putting pressure on other services because of the changing, if you like, daily calendar of working life, and the need for businesses to invest in cool spaces and so on, which also came in elsewhere, I think, in terms of where did that? It came in somewhere else in terms of business profitability in this wholesale retail side, in that if we're needing to understand and define what acceptable heat thresholds are at work, and therefore businesses need to obviously observe those, then that might mean that there's increased energy demand and cost, but also impacts on business profit through the air conditioning, whatever it is, but reduced operations and working hours. In terms of transport and trade, we too talked about local production distribution systems, and about potentially that reducing the options to consumers, but also increasing the exposure to local risks. So one advantage that I guess Gideon was mentioning at the start was the diversifying sources is understood in a general sense, or believed to spread the nature of the risk, whereas locally, obviously, if you're depending on food from a more local area, when you get hit by an extreme event, it does affect you more specifically and more deeply. We also talked about disposal and reuse, and that was around the consumer expectations and understanding of reducing waste. And I think the thing here was the positive of the opportunity to feed a growing population without increasing food production, but also things like alternative use of food waste, and potentially high temperatures might increase compost degradation. Finally, on consuming barbecue food, likely to lead to increases in wildfires, particularly where that's outside sort of the home and garden environment, and potentially in high temperatures, increased health and food poisoning risks. There was a positive that was very popular about increasing continental healthy ice cream sort of parlours or stands that used more planetary friendly, if you like, less dairy based sorbets and things, and less alcohol and dairy based means of cooling people. So not something I could think about very much when it's quite so cold outside, but it sounds good for the summer. And also around local food transport and delivery. So this could bring in alternative transport methods. And we talked a bit about rail there. And I don't think there were some things that we didn't really understand in terms of there's a lot more rail transport on the continent and elsewhere around the world. And of course, if rail buckling is a big issue causing speed restrictions on the rail network in the UK because of the design thresholds, it's quite a significant investment to upgrade that. The next one was around international consequences, and we too talked about cropping diversity and shifting the patterns of cropping to help adapt and maintain resilience, but also the positive really of encouraging a shift to more regenerative and agroecological farming systems internationally, not just at home. Between production and processing, there was also a bit of a focus around particularly the fruit and vegetables that we're dependent on, and the water shortages, and potentially the need for increased irrigation, which might then increase pathogens on fruit and vegetable foodstuffs and lead to consumer concerns, which could feed into less healthy diets as a result. In terms of transport and trade, we talked about global agreements and what's expected in terms of overall food systems outcomes. And the concern there was, could these match the pace needed for local adaptation? So particularly in other global regions where the pace of climate change may be faster or more impactful because of being closer to thresholds due to their climate zone, and or related to socioeconomic factors and the capability and capacity to adapt. So can those sorts of global agreements match evenly, if you like, as well as the changing tastes of the market, potentially increasing introducing new pathogens due to increased import and trade. In terms of storing, we talked a bit about, particularly overseas, is storage capacity and capability in particular, and technology poorer, but could this be mitigated by later harvesting varieties and things like that? So actually we avoid the need to store some of these crops for such a long period in the first place. There was some discussion around wholesale and retail about food toxins and contamination, the need for testing, and the need for education. In terms of disposal and reuse, I think in the previous breakout, we talked about legal regulation of acceptable levels of large-scale food waste, but this introduces obviously cost and time and extra administration into the food chain, which could then knock onto consumer prices and supply disruptions. Finally, again, here we talked about local food systems also overseas and about their impacts too on the economy, positive or negative, unclear, but the reduction in food miles, the potential for healthy seasonal eating, and again, the potential for more local exposure to extremes. So that's everything from our group that I picked up. Just wondered, would either of my co-facilitators like to add anything in there, Katie or Elsa? Is there anything?
That was really comprehensive, Pete. I'm not sure we can add anything more to that one.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think that's really the end. Well, the end of the feeding back session. I think there's some fascinating insights there that we've drawn together. And I think first of all, I'll just ask, are there any immediate questions for the feedback from the different breakout groups? Is there anything anyone would like to ask? Please pop it in the chat or the Q&A if so, or raise your hand. All sounds like you're clear there in general. Summary of the breakout groups before the next meeting. Yes, possibly. So what we actually need to do as the organising team in order to make the next meeting happen is to summarise those into the, I think some of you might have seen the summary boards, which kind of have the top adaptation and policy options and the consequences for each hazard and each area and so on. So we need to fill those out to inform next week's meeting. So we will see if we can maybe share a PDF of those or something in advance and draw on our notes. We'll certainly be doing that after the workshops and trying to share what we can. Okay, so I think Anthony, you've got a question.
Yeah,
please.
it's question / comment, I suppose, although I hate it when people do that. The conversation we had about different transport routes, for example, so possible mitigation, the possibility of rail mitigation, and whether that'd be better or worse, or whether that would respond better or worse to some of the changes we were talking about. It would possibly be useful for a community, including the people who are in this workshop, to be able to tap into sources of evidence for that sort of thing, I guess. I know it's periodically will be produced as a report, but the reports will go out of date as soon as they exist, I guess. I don't know if there's an easy mechanism for getting, if I have a question to inform it, if after this workshop, one of us wanted to go away and find out a bit more about how feasible it would be or whether there would be a benefit in encouraging promotion of rail as a mechanism for transport of food products, let's say, what would we do? Is there currently a mechanism for it that I'm simply not aware of, or is it just something we have to just start from scratch each time, or is there a way of forming whether it's a formal community or just a network or a mailing list or something that would help people to locate evidence that help them to make informed policy decisions around this?
It's a really good question. So I think one thing I would say from the top level, probably in terms of climate risks, I guess, and I think at times it's possibly underutilized in this sense, but the climate change risk assessment and the depths of, that really is a great, in the depths of the reports on the particular sectors, is a really great resource on the state of evidence and what we know around climate risk. So that's always a good place to look. And I always find when I go and look back there, there's stuff I've forgotten that was there. So there will be stuff there on transport. But I think the wider point is really about how we keep in touch as a community. And it's something I don't yet have a strong answer to, but I'm very much aware of from the workshop survey, and as I said, there's an interest in networking and connecting, so I think it's something we'll take away and discuss and work out the best way to make that happen. Basically, I don't have an answer today, but I completely agree that there's a need for that, and it would be useful for a community to be able to ask questions and support each other in that way too. That's Interesting. I see what you've put in there. The
Sorry, I
impact
can come a bit. I did have a look because we've been asked to contribute, and I'll probably drop you an email separately about this. We've been asked to help inform the FSA response to the climate change risk assessment and impact on food safety and food security side of things, given the FSA's remit. And I was quite surprised that compared to lots of other things, there are some aspects of that risk assessment includes an assessment the risk to food safety and food security is low, I think, and low works out at some extremely low level, I think, per capita, I guess. So if there's more than a 2% change in food prices, let's say, as a result of all of the effects of climate change, then it should be higher than that. And if we, as we've seen with Ukraine, for example, there are relatively, not minor shocks by any means, but lesser than you'd expect the overall sum of climate change to have. Can have huge effects on affordability and food availability. So there's clearly some ways that needs to be tweaked, I think, by next time, but it's something else we can pick up.
Absolutely, yeah. Fantastic. So if there aren't specific questions out of the breakout groups, I think now what we can do is move to a general question and answer, comment, discussion session. So first in, we have something from Bernd Eggen. Hello, Bernd. So is there much known about nutritional differences, especially under climate change, between C3 and C4, the different biological pathway carbon fixation plants? Most crops in the UK are still C3, except maize, which is C4. C4 plants are more resilient to heat and drought, though they may have different nutritional values. In a UK context, I'm not so sure. I know there's some really good work Jenny McDermid does at the University of Aberdeen around food and nutrition, the nutrition end, and there's certainly been, well, that's partly the work I was referring to from COP27 in the GRCF AfriCap project. Some of which was presented there. I'm not entirely sure quite how far we go all the way through from sort of the climate risk to through the production and so on to nutrition in that sense. So a good question, and the differences between the two plants. I guess the question here is a more general one. Do we have any crop nutrition specialists here who would advise on this? Were we to switch to much more maize, for example, in the UK, what's the nutritional impact of substituting wheat with maize? Do feel free to stick anything in the chat, but any more general question and answer? Stacey, yeah, please do.
Sorry, I was just taking on the question out. Ignore that, Pete.
Okay, no problem. You're very quiet today. Maybe we've worn you out with all our questioning and post-its. Yeah, that's certainly true. So Dominic Eyre says in the chat, a large proportion of crops are used as fodder, particularly maize. So at the present time. Good. Any more question and answers? Or anything you would generally like to ask or raise or make a comment on? Very quiet. Okay. Luke is saying, yeah, a general crop, a general issue around crop diversification and the extent to which a more diverse set of crops may confer resilience. Jess Finch from Defra 2, how do you envisage the outputs of these workshops being used? Yeah, so I will come to that. Maybe if I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll explain the next steps, and that might help with that, might raise some more questions. Could I grab control of the slide deck, please, just so or advance me to the next one? Seeing the bar.
should have control now, Pete.
I do.
That popped up. I can move it for you if you like.
No, you've got it. Yeah, perfect. It's just appeared. Thank you, Rachel. Now, it's taking a while to respond. So next steps basically are, as hopefully most of you know, next week we are holding the final part of this workshop, which essentially we're going to do a very similar thing, but we'll be looking at 2 breakouts that look at, first of all, trying to identify quick wins and more major projects in terms of taking this area forward, and also trying to understand really what some of the major drivers and factors in the food chain and affecting the food chain might be with to meet these ambitions and help to define scenarios moving forward. So there will be a post-event survey at the end of all of this. We will be sharing recordings and slides. What we would like to do is pull together some form of summary white paper, potentially to be peer reviewed. We'll see how it goes, but drawing on all of this and the analysis of the survey. So I think we would like to use that to be quite accessible to a wide audience. We would like to include and recognise all your inputs here in an appropriate way yet to be defined, but yeah, we will definitely be drawing all of this together and what we learn, of course, on Friday into that summary paper. So that's really the key thing that we want to do, and then there's a question of how we will get that disseminated and out there. So any questions before I move to thanking everyone for taking part? Let's just see what's coming in. Chat's disappeared for me.
Yeah, Pete, there's a question in the chat about how much of UK agriculture production is used as animal feed. Don't know if anybody on the call has a figure for that.
I do not know off the top of my head, I'm afraid. Oh, Luke's got his hand up. Luke, could you, are you happy to answer that one?
Yeah, I mean, well, it varies by crop type, but as a rule of thumb, I kind of generally think about sort of 40% is used as input to livestock systems. And that kind of sounds quite bad, but in some cases, the use of land to produce high energy feeds like that can significantly reduce the land use requirements of production. So to kind of achieve an equivalent energy diet on a pasture basis might require up to 5 times as much land in some cases. So there are definite benefits of feeding specific types of cereals or grains to livestock. But, you know, it's a fine balance and you need to think about it in the round.
Is some of it, from what I understand, an issue of sort of quality as well, that some of them are, you know, in terms of the end use of the crops? Yeah, if Luke could just respond, I was just interested to.
Yeah, definitely. That's the case, Pete. So, you know, some crops that don't meet specification find their way into the livestock feed diet, and actually, sort of interestingly, the amount of potential food waste which is diverted into livestock feeds is increasing. So that can act as an alternative to things like imported soy meal, which is obviously not very sustainable. And we're seeing more things like confectionery waste used in that context, for example.
The final questions or comments before we move on and close? Sounds like you are all happy, which is great. Okay, in which case I will just close by again thanking you all for attending, particularly thanks to our speakers today, Gideon and Judith, for their fantastic talks. Have a big organising team and lots of facilitators to thank here, as well as virtual approval, our technical partners who've been running around behind the scenes and making everything work for us so seamlessly, which has been fantastic. as well as all of our sponsors and partners, particularly Defra, for funding and sponsoring this work. And finally, of course, thank you very much for attending. Tom, you've actually just noticed you've got your hand up. Please, before I close it.
Yeah, there was just a comment in the chat I thought is worth highlighting for you, Pete. Is Monica Zurek has commented saying they're unfortunately unable to attend much of next week's workshop, but would like to continue to be involved in this work. What's the best mechanism to do so?
Good point. Okay, so that I think that kind of relates to the question earlier from Anthony about sort of maintaining the network somehow. I think it's a really good point. One other thing I will point out is I'm strongly linked to something. I can see Sarah Bridle here is on the call. The UKRI, we're both involved in the UKRI Net Zero. Well, let me get this right. Agri-Food for Net Zero network, which is, as it says, and I think there's an important thing in drawing these networks together. There's so much overlap between net zero and adaptation and the wider sustainability. There may be a way to link in with that as some mechanism. That's led by Angelina Sanderson-Bellamy at the University of West England. But some of us will take this away and work out what the best way to do that we think is to do that, because I think it's an important point. And actually, in the work we do at the Met Office in supporting Defra's evidence needs in agri-food system resilience, collaboration and drawing on a broader community is increasingly important. So we're very keen to do that indeed. Thank you. Yeah, okay. Well, I will finish there by just saying thank you all for attending, unless there's anything else. Oh yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks for sharing that. Thank you very much for attending, for your time, for your efforts and energy, and hopefully we will see many of you next week. Thank you.